The Arizona sun blazed overhead as I stood in the corner of the Desert Ridge Country Club ballroom, watching my own brother's wedding reception unfold without me. Crystal glasses caught the light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Laughter echoed off polished marble floors. And for the past 3 hours, I might as well have been invisible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm 42 years old, and I command over 14,000 soldiers as a 4-star general in the United States Army. Right now, though, I'm just the sister nobody wanted to invite, standing alone while my family celebrates without me. The irony isn't lost on me. I've briefed presidents, commanded operations across 3 continents, and earned respect in rooms filled with the most powerful military leaders in the world. But here, surrounded by relatives who share my DNA, I'm nothing more than an unwelcome guest they hope will disappear before the cake is cut. The wedding coordinator glides past me for the 4th time, her eyes scanning the room but never quite landing on me. She's been instructed, I realize. Told to treat me like furniture. Background noise. The kind of person you acknowledge with a polite nod but never actually engage with in conversation. I watch my brother Danny adjust his bow tie, his face glowing with the kind of happiness I haven't seen from him in years. He looks older now, more settled, the wild edges of his youth smoothed into something respectable. His bride, Captain Sarah Chen, stands beside him in her elegant ivory dress, her military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. She carries herself with the confidence I recognize in soldiers who've seen real combat, the kind of composure that only comes from facing fire and walking away. The reception hall buzzes with the comfortable chaos of celebration. Children dart between tables while their parents sip champagne and swap stories. The elderly relatives hold court near the dessert station, their voices rising with each retelling of family legends. Everyone belongs somewhere, fits into some constellation of connection and shared memory. Everyone except me. I smooth the fabric of my navy dress, chosen specifically because it wouldn't draw attention. No uniform today. No ribbons or insignia that might remind people of who I really am outside these walls. My mother made that request clear in her phone call 2 weeks ago. "Please, Rebecca," she'd said in that tired voice she reserved for conversations about my career. "Just blend in, don't make it about your military things." My military things. As if 2 decades of service, 3 combat tours, and a chest full of medals were some embarrassing hobby I'd picked up in college. The memory of that conversation still stings. Not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't say. No congratulations on my recent promotion to 4-star general. No acknowledgement that I'd become one of only 11 women in U.S. history to achieve that rank. No pride in the daughter who dedicated her life to serving something bigger than herself. Just a request to disappear. I find my assigned table near the kitchen doors, far from the head table where family should sit. Table 15. The number feels deliberate, like they counted exactly how far away they could place me without it looking completely obvious. The other seats at my table remain empty. Either nobody else was assigned here, or they were smart enough to find seats elsewhere. The centerpiece is beautiful, a careful arrangement of desert wildflowers and sage that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. I run my fingers along the delicate petals of a prickly pear blossom, its vibrant pink a stark contrast to the pristine white tablecloth. From where I sit, I can see my parents at the head table. My father, Bob Martinez, looks distinguished in his charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled for the photographs that will commemorate this day. He's telling some story to the guests beside him, his hands gesturing animatedly, his face lit with the kind of warmth he saves for special occasions. My mother, Patricia, sits with her back ramrod straight, every inch the retired school principal she once was. Her navy dress matches mine almost exactly, which would be funny if it weren't so perfectly symbolic of how we've always moved in parallel lines, never quite intersecting. Neither of them has looked my way since the ceremony ended. I remember being 7 years old, watching my father teach Danny how to throw a baseball in our backyard in Ahwatukee. Even then, I knew I was watching something I'd never be part of. The easy camaraderie between father and son, the shared language of sports and competition, the assumption that certain dreams belong to certain people. When I announced my intention to apply to West Point, my father had laughed. Not cruelly, but with the kind of gentle dismissal reserved for children who declare they want to be astronauts or movie stars. "That's nice, Mija," he'd said, ruffling my hair. "But maybe think about something more realistic. Teaching, like your mother. Or nursing. Something that fits. Something that fits." Those words had followed me through 4 years at the academy, through Ranger School, through every promotion and commendation and battlefield decision that had brought me to this moment. Even now, wearing 4 stars that represent the trust of an entire nation, I can still hear the echo of that gentle dismissal. The string quartet begins a new song, something soft and romantic that draws the wedding party onto the dance floor. Danny spins Sarah with practiced ease, their movements synchronized in the way of couples who've learned to anticipate each other's steps. She laughs at something he whispers in her ear, and for a moment, her face transforms from military professional to radiant bride. I find myself wondering what she sees in him, this accomplished officer who could have chosen anyone. Danny's always been charming, the golden child who could talk his way out of trouble and into opportunity with equal ease. But Sarah's different. There's steel beneath her smile, the kind of strength forged in places where weakness means death. She reminds me of myself at that age, before I learned to carry the weight of other people's expectations like armor. The DJ's voice crackles through the sound system, announcing the father-daughter dance. I watch my father escort Danny's new wife onto the floor, his movements careful and formal. Sarah follows his lead with grace, but I can see the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes scan the room even while she smiles. Old habits. Once a soldier, always a soldier. That's when our eyes meet across the crowded dance floor. Just for a second, Sarah's gaze finds mine, and something flickers in her expression. Recognition? Maybe. Or curiosity. Her head tilts slightly, the way people do when they're trying to place a face, trying to connect dots that don't quite align. I look away quickly, focusing instead on the desert landscape visible through the windows. The saguaro cacti stand like ancient sentinels against the sunset, their arms raised in permanent surrender to the vastness of the Arizona sky. This landscape shaped me, taught me that survival means finding water in impossible places, that strength comes from learning to bend without breaking. But sitting here now, invisible in my own family's celebration, I wonder if I've bent so far that I've forgotten how to stand straight. The path that led me to this moment started long before I ever dreamed of wearing stars on my collar. Growing up in the Martinez household meant understanding your place in the carefully constructed hierarchy that my mother ruled with the precision of a drill sergeant and the warmth of a guidance counselor. Danny was the crown prince, destined for greatness in whatever field caught his fancy that week. I was the spare, the backup plan, the daughter who tried too hard and dreamed too big. My earliest memory of feeling different happened when I was 9 years old. Danny had broken Mom's favorite vase while practicing his baseball swing in the living room, sending ceramic shards across the hardwood floor like tiny white explosions. When our parents discovered the destruction, Danny stood there with his lower lip trembling, big brown eyes filled with perfectly calculated remorse. "It was an accident, Mom," he'd whispered, and somehow managed to look even smaller despite being 2 years older than me. I was just trying to practice like Dad taught me. The punishment was swift but gentle, a week without his Game Boy and a heartfelt apology. But when I'd accidentally spilled grape juice on the same Persian rug 3 months later, the response was entirely different. No tears could soften my mother's disappointment, no explanations could diminish the lecture about responsibility and consequences that followed me to my room. That night, lying in my narrow twin bed with its pink comforter covered in cartoon princesses that I already found embarrassing, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. If being good wasn't enough, if being sorry didn't matter, then I would become someone who didn't need forgiveness. I would become someone who didn't make mistakes. The military precision that would later define my career started in that small bedroom in Awatuki. I began making my bed with hospital corners, organizing my homework with color-coded folders, speaking only when I had something important to contribute. I studied harder, ran faster, jumped higher, always reaching for some impossible standard that seemed to move further away with each achievement. When I brought home straight A's, my parents celebrated with dinner at Denny's. When Danny managed to pull his grades up to mostly B's, we went to Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. When I won the regional science fair, I got a congratulatory card and $20. When Danny made junior varsity football as a sophomore, my father took a week off work to attend every practice. The inequity wasn't malicious, which somehow made it worse. Malice you can fight against, understand, overcome. But the gentle, unconscious preference for my brother felt like gravity, a natural law that couldn't be questioned or changed, only endured. High school brought new challenges and familiar patterns. I threw myself into ROTC, finding in the structured environment something my home had never provided: clear expectations and fair consequences. Colonel Martinez, no relation despite the shared name, became the first adult who saw potential in my intensity, rather than something to be managed or softened. "You've got command presence, cadet," he told me after I'd led our unit to victory in the state competition. "That's not something you can teach. Either you have it or you don't." I carried those words home like a secret treasure, but when I shared them at dinner, the response was predictably lukewarm. "That's nice, mija," my mother said, passing the enchiladas without meeting my eyes. "Just don't let it go to your head." Meanwhile, Danny's latest girlfriend got more attention at that same dinner, my parents hanging on every word about her college plans and career aspirations. She was studying communications, planning to work in marketing, and somehow this seemed infinitely more worthy of interest than my acceptance to West Point. The night I received my appointment to the academy, I waited until after dinner to share the news. I'd practiced the words in my mirror, trying to find the right tone, casual enough not to seem boastful, but confident enough to convey the magnitude of what I'd accomplished. Getting into West Point wasn't like getting into a regular college. It was a statement about character, about potential, about the kind of person the United States Army believed could lead soldiers in combat. "I got my appointment," I announced as my mother cleared the dessert plates. "To West Point. Full scholarship." My father looked up from his coffee, confusion creasing his forehead. "Appointment to what?" "West Point, the military academy, in New York." Each word felt heavier than the last, sinking into the silence that followed like stones into still water. Oh, my... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mother's voice carried a note I'd never heard before, something between disappointment and fear. "Rebecca, honey, are you sure about this? It's so far away, and military life is so uncertain." Uncertain. The words stung more than outright disapproval would have. It suggested that my carefully laid plans, my years of preparation, my dreams of serving something greater than myself, were just a phase, a teenage rebellion that would pass once I came to my senses. "It's what I want," I said quietly, but even as the words left my mouth, I could feel my conviction wavering under their collective doubt. Danny chose that moment to announce that he'd been offered a position at his friend's father's insurance company, a summer job that could turn into something permanent if he played his cards right. The conversation shifted immediately, my parents peppering him with questions about salary and benefits and growth opportunities. My appointment to one of the most prestigious institutions in the country was forgotten before the coffee grew cold. The years that followed established a pattern that would define our relationship for decades. Every achievement I earned was met with polite acknowledgement and subtle concern. Every setback Danny faced was treated as a family crisis requiring all hands on deck. When I graduated from West Point in the top 10% of my class, my parents attended the ceremony, but spent most of the weekend worrying about Danny's latest breakup. When I completed Ranger School, becoming one of only a handful of women to earn the tab at that time. The phone call home was interrupted by news that Danny had finally proposed to his longtime girlfriend Monica. Military life provided its own rewards, its own family of sorts. The soldiers under my command respected my decisions, trusted my judgment, followed me into situations where following meant the difference between coming home and becoming a name on a wall. I found purpose in leadership, satisfaction in the knowledge that my choices mattered, that lives depended on my ability to remain calm under pressure and make the right call when everything was falling apart. But even success in my chosen field couldn't fill the hollow space that should have been occupied by family pride. Every promotion brought its own mix of accomplishment and loneliness. I would call home to share the news, hoping this time would be different. This time they would understand what I had achieved. The conversation when I made Colonel followed the familiar script. "That's wonderful, Mija," my mother said, but I could hear her washing dishes in the background, the clink of plates against porcelain, suggesting that this news was worth exactly as much attention as she could spare while multitasking. "Just promise me you're being careful. All those dangerous places you go." Dangerous places? As if my deployments were reckless adventures, rather than carefully planned operations designed to protect American interests and allies. As if the medals on my chest represented lucky accidents rather than calculated courage under fire. The real breaking point came 5 years ago, at my father's retirement party. The whole extended family had gathered at our house in Ahwatukee, the backyard decorated with string lights and folding tables groaning under the weight of too much food. I'd flown in from Fort Bragg, where I was serving as a brigade commander, exhausted from 3 months of training exercises but determined to be present for this milestone. The evening started pleasantly enough. Aunts and uncles I hadn't seen in years asked polite questions about my career, nodding along as I explained my current responsibilities in terms they might understand. But as the night wore on and the beer flowed more freely, the conversation took a familiar turn. "You know what I don't understand?" Uncle Raphael announced to the table where I sat picking at my second plate of carnitas. "Is why Rebecca never got married. Good-looking girl like that, smart too. What's wrong with the men in the army?" The question hung in the desert air like humidity, heavy and uncomfortable. I felt every eye at the table turn toward me, waiting for an explanation I'd given too many times before. There was nothing wrong with the men in the army. There had been relationships, some serious, some casual, some that might have led to marriage if I'd been willing to compromise my career for love. But that wasn't the real question Uncle Raphael was asking. The real question was why I'd chosen a life that made traditional happiness difficult, why I'd prioritized achievement over family, why I couldn't just be normal like other women my age. "I've been focused on my career," I answered, the same response I'd perfected over years of similar inquiries. "The military demands a lot of time and attention." "But you're not getting any younger," Aunt Carmen chimed in, her voice carrying the kind of concern that felt more like criticism. "Maybe it's time to think about settling down, starting a family. You can't be a soldier forever." That's when my mother decided to join the conversation, her timing perfect for maximum impact. "We've all been worried about Rebecca," she announced to the table, as if I weren't sitting right there. "She's so isolated, always moving from base to base. No roots, no stability. It's not natural for a woman." The words hit me like physical blows. Not natural. As if my service to my country was a personality defect. A failure to conform to some predetermined script about what women should want from life. I looked around the table, searching for an ally. Someone who might point out that my isolation was largely by choice. That my moves were promotions reflecting trust and responsibility. That my life had meaning and purpose even if it didn't fit their narrow definition of success. Instead, I found Danny nodding along with the assessment, his expression sympathetic but not surprised. "Mom's right," he said, reaching across the table to pat my hand like I was a child who needed comfort. "You should think about taking one of those desk jobs in DC, maybe meet someone normal, someone outside the military bubble. Someone normal." The phrase echoed Uncle Raphael's question, carried the same implicit judgment that there was something fundamentally wrong with the choices I'd made, the person I'd become. These people who claimed to love me couldn't see past their own limited vision of what my life should look like to appreciate what it actually was. I excused myself from the table, mumbling something about helping with dessert, and found refuge in the kitchen where my cousin Maria was arranging flan on paper plates. She looked up when I entered, her expression immediately shifting to concern. "You okay, Prima? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," I lied, but Maria had known me since childhood and wasn't fooled by surface explanations. "They don't mean to hurt you," she said quietly, glancing toward the backyard where laughter indicated the conversation had moved on to safer topics. "They just don't understand what you do, how important it is. To them, success looks like a house in the suburbs and kids playing in the yard." Her words were meant to comfort, but they only highlighted the fundamental disconnect between the life I'd chosen and the life my family could accept. Understanding wasn't really the issue. The problem was that they didn't want to understand, didn't see value in perspectives that challenged their own assumptions about happiness and fulfillment. That night marked the beginning of a gradual but deliberate distancing. I still called on birthdays and holidays, still sent gifts and Christmas cards, but the easy intimacy that had once existed between us was gone. I stopped sharing details about my deployments, stopped trying to explain why my work mattered, stopped hoping they would eventually see me as something other than a failed version of the daughter they'd wanted. The invitation to Danny's wedding had arrived 6 weeks ago, a formal card with elegant script and subtle desert motifs. No personal note, no acknowledgement of the years that had passed since we'd been in the same room, just my name written in careful calligraphy and a checkbox marked for one guest, not two. The message was clear. I was welcome, barely, but not welcome enough to bring someone, not important enough to merit the assumption that I might have a partner worth including in their celebration. The phone call from my mother 3 days after the invitation arrived had been even more revealing. I was in my office at Fort Carson, reviewing tactical assessments for an upcoming joint exercise, when my aide knocked and informed me that I had a personal call. The timing was unusual. My family knew better than to call during business hours unless there was an emergency. "Rebecca, honey, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," my mother's voice carried across the miles with its familiar mix of affection and subtle dismissal. Important. As if commanding a missile defense installation wasn't inherently important. As if my work was just an elaborate hobby that could be set aside whenever family matters required attention. "What can I do for you, Mom?" I kept my voice neutral, professional, the same tone I used with subordinates who were testing boundaries. "Well, I wanted to talk to you about the wedding. I know you received the invitation. And I want you to know how much it means to Danny that you'll be there." The pause that followed was loaded with unspoken expectations, the kind of silence that demanded reassurance. "Of course I'll be there. He's my brother." "Yes, well, that's wonderful. But I wanted to discuss a few things with you, just to make sure the day goes smoothly for everyone." The careful phrasing set off alarm bells in my head. In my mother's vocabulary, everyone was code for everyone except you. "What kind of things?" Another pause, longer this time, filled with the sound of her gathering courage for a conversation she clearly didn't want to have. "Well, the venue is quite formal, very elegant. Sarah's family is very traditional, very conservative. Her father is a retired judge, very proper. And we want to make sure that nothing overshadows the bride and groom." Nothing. Such a small word to carry such an enormous weight of implication. Nothing meant me, my presence, my achievements, my very existence as someone who might draw attention away from the designated stars of the show. "I'm not planning to overshadow anyone, Mom. I'm just planning to attend my brother's wedding." "Of course, honey, I know that. But you understand how people can be. When they see someone in uniform, especially someone with your rank, it can become the focus of conversation. And this day should be about Danny and Sarah, not about anyone else's career accomplishments." The word accomplishments came out strained, as if she were forcing herself to acknowledge that my decades of service constituted something positive rather than an embarrassing deviation from normal life. But even that grudging recognition was immediately qualified by the suggestion that acknowledging my achievements would somehow diminish her son's happiness. "I wasn't planning to wear my uniform," I said quietly, though part of me bristled at the implication that my service was something shameful to be hidden. Oh good, that's good. And maybe, well, if people ask what you do for work, perhaps you could just say you work for the government? Keep it simple, you know? Some of Sarah's family is very anti-war, very political. We don't want any awkward conversations. Anti-war, political. As if my role in defending their freedom to hold those opinions was itself a political statement, rather than a professional obligation. As if the men and women under my command, who risk their lives every day, were engaged in some controversial hobby, rather than essential service to their nation. I see. The words came out colder than I intended, but I was past caring about diplomatic niceties. Anything else I should know about how to behave at my own brother's wedding? Rebecca, please don't take it like that. I'm just trying to make sure everyone has a good time. You know how complicated family events can be when people have strong opinions about things. Things. Another euphemism. Another way of reducing my life's work to something vaguely unpleasant that polite people didn't discuss in mixed company. Like bathroom habits or tax problems, my military career was apparently something that made other people uncomfortable and should therefore be minimized for their convenience. I understand perfectly, Mom. I'll make sure to be as invisible as possible. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Don't be dramatic. I just want this to be a perfect day for Danny and Sarah. Surely you can understand that. Perfect. The word that had defined my childhood, the impossible standard that I'd chased through decades of service, only to discover that perfection in my mother's eyes meant disappearing entirely, rather than excelling beyond recognition. After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the commendation letters on my wall, the photographs of myself with various dignitaries and fellow officers, the tangible evidence of a career that had taken me to the highest levels of military leadership. None of it mattered to the people who shared my blood. None of it was worth celebrating or even acknowledging in polite company. The decision to attend despite everything wasn't born of hope for reconciliation or dreams of acceptance. It was simpler than that, and perhaps more stubborn. Danny was getting married, and I wanted to see him happy. Regardless of how my family felt about me, regardless of how they planned to treat me, I loved my brother and wanted to witness this important moment in his life. But there was something else. Something I didn't want to admit even to myself. I was curious about Sarah Chen, this woman who had somehow captured my brother's heart and convinced him to commit to something permanent. The few details I'd gleaned from family conversations painted her as accomplished, intelligent, serious. Nothing like the parade of party girls and social butterflies that Danny had dated throughout his 20s and early 30s. Sarah was career military, a captain in Army intelligence with deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan. She spoke 3 languages, held a master's degree in international relations, and according to my mother's grudging reports, had impressed everyone she met with her combination of grace and competence. On paper, she sounded like someone I might actually respect, possibly even like. The possibility that my brother had finally chosen a partner worthy of his better angels gave me hope that this wedding might be different from other family gatherings. Maybe Sarah would understand what I did, would see value in military service that transcended politics and social discomfort. Maybe she would be an ally in a room full of people who saw my career as an inconvenience. Or maybe she would be just like them, polite but distant, someone who had served her time and moved on to more respectable pursuits like marriage and family life. The fact that she was marrying Danny suggested she valued the kind of stable, conventional happiness that my family prized above all else. The flight from Colorado Springs to Phoenix gave me 3 hours to prepare mentally for what awaited. I chose my outfit carefully. A navy dress that was elegant but unremarkable, professional but not intimidating. No jewelry, except for small pearl earrings, no makeup beyond the minimum required for respectability. I was aiming for invisible, just as my mother had requested. The rental car at Sky Harbor was a generic sedan, nothing that would draw attention or suggest success beyond the ordinary. I drove through the familiar streets of Phoenix with a strange mixture of nostalgia and detachment, noting the new developments and changed storefronts while feeling like a tourist in my own hometown. The hotel I'd chosen was deliberately modest, a business-class establishment near the airport rather than one of the luxury resorts closer to the wedding venue. No point in advertising that I could afford better, No reason to provide ammunition for conversations about how I'd gotten above my raising or forgotten where I came from. Check-in was efficient and anonymous. The desk clerk processed my reservation with professional disinterest, handing over the keycard without recognition or commentary. For someone accustomed to being saluted and addressed by rank, the ordinariness was almost refreshing. My room was clean and functional, equipped with everything necessary for a brief stay. I hung my dress in the closet, arranged my few toiletries in the bathroom, and sat on the edge of the bed to call Danny's house and confirm my attendance at the rehearsal dinner. Monica answered the phone, my brother's ex-wife who had somehow remained part of the family circle despite their divorce 3 years earlier. Her voice carried the same forced cheer that characterized most of our interactions, the tone of someone determined to be friendly while keeping careful distance. "Rebecca, how wonderful that you made it in. Danny will be so happy to see you. We're all so excited for tomorrow." The enthusiasm felt manufactured, but I played along with the script. "I'm looking forward to it too. Is there anything I can bring to the rehearsal dinner? Anything I can help with?" "Oh no, everything's taken care of. Sarah's family has been so generous, so organized. You just need to show up and enjoy yourself. The restaurant is beautiful, very upscale. I think you'll love it. Very upscale." The emphasis suggested either a warning about dress code or a subtle reminder that this level of sophistication might be beyond my usual experience. Given that I'd attended state dinners at the Pentagon and diplomatic receptions in 3 different countries, the implication was almost amusing. "I'm sure it will be lovely. What time should I be there?" 7 o'clock sharp. You know how Sarah's father is about punctuality. Military precision and all that. The laugh that followed was slightly strained, as if acknowledging any connection between Sarah's father and my own military experience was somehow awkward. Military precision. The phrase that my family used to describe any behavior that seemed too rigid or demanding, any expectation that people might actually do what they said they would do when they said they would do it. In their world, punctuality was a character flaw rather than a virtue, a sign that someone took themselves too seriously. "I'll be there," I promised, and ended the call before the conversation could deteriorate into more pointed observations about my personality defects. The rehearsal dinner was held at a steakhouse in Scottsdale, the kind of establishment that catered to business executives and wealthy retirees, with its dark wood paneling and oversized portions. I arrived exactly on time, as promised, and found myself in a private dining room filled with people I mostly didn't recognize. Danny looked nervous but happy, his smile genuine when he spotted me near the entrance. He crossed the room quickly, his arms opening for a hug that felt real rather than obligatory. "Becca, God, it's good to see you. You look great, really great. How was the flight?" For a moment, he was just my little brother again, the boy who used to follow me around the backyard and beg me to push him higher on the swing set. The years fell away, along with the accumulated weight of family disappointment and mutual misunderstanding. "It was fine. Congratulations, Danny. I'm really happy for you." "Thanks, sis. That means a lot, really. Come on, let me introduce you to Sarah's family. They're great people, you're gonna love them." He guided me through the room, his hand on my elbow in a gesture that felt protective rather than controlling. The introductions were smooth and polite, a parade of judges and lawyers and business owners who shook my hand firmly and asked the inevitable questions about my work. Following my mother's advice, I described myself as a government employee, keeping the details vague enough to avoid uncomfortable follow-up questions. Most people seemed satisfied with the non-answer, filing me away as someone forgettable who worked in some bureaucratic capacity that didn't merit further investigation. But then Danny introduced me to Sarah's father, retired Judge William Chen, and the dynamic shifted entirely. Judge Chen was a tall man with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog details automatically. When Danny introduced me as his sister who worked for the government, something flickered across the judge's expression, a moment of calculation that suggested he was processing information beyond the surface pleasantries. "Ms. Martinez," he said, extending his hand with formal courtesy, "it's a pleasure to meet you. Sarah has mentioned that Danny has a sister in federal service. Which department, if you don't mind my asking?" The question was posed with the kind of gentle authority that comes from decades of extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. I could feel Danny tense beside me, clearly hoping I would stick to the vague script we'd established. But something in Judge Chen's manner suggested that evasion would be both pointless and disrespectful. Department of Defense, I replied, meeting his gaze directly. Army. His eyebrows rose slightly, and I saw his mental gears shifting as he reassessed everything about me, from my posture to my handshake to the way I'd answered his question without qualification or apology. Army, he repeated thoughtfully. What's your current assignment if that's not classified information? Danny's hand tightened on my elbow, a subtle warning to keep things simple, but I was past caring about his comfort level. Judge Chen deserved a straight answer, and I was tired of pretending that my career was something shameful. I command the Space and Missile Defense Command at Fort Carson, I said simply. The silence that followed was brief, but profound. Judge Chen's expression shifted from polite interest to something approaching respect, while Danny looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. Around us, conversation continued, but I could feel the ripple effect of my words spreading through the immediate vicinity. Command, Judge Chen said slowly, and there was a new weight to the word when he spoke it. That's quite an accomplishment. What rank, if you don't mind the question? 4-star General, I replied, and watched his eyebrows climb toward his hairline. The reaction was immediate and undeniable. Judge Chen straightened almost imperceptibly, his entire demeanor shifting into something that bordered on deference. Behind him, I saw Sarah's head turn sharply in our direction, her conversation with my mother apparently forgotten as she registered the change in her father's posture. General Martinez, Judge Chen said, and this time when he extended his hand, it was with the kind of formal recognition usually reserved for foreign dignitaries. It's an honor, ma'am, truly an honor. The ma'am hung in the air like a small explosion. Around us, other conversations faltered as people registered the sudden formality, the shift in dynamics that suggested something significant had just occurred. I felt Danny's grip on my elbow loosen as he processed what had just happened, the careful script he'd planned dissolving in the face of his future father-in-law's obvious respect. Thank you, Judge Chen. And congratulations on Sarah's promotion to captain. Intelligence work is challenging under the best circumstances. His smile broadened at the acknowledgement of his daughter's achievements. You know about Sarah's military service? I make it my business to know about the officers in my command structure, even indirectly. Captain Chen has an impressive record. The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd had with my family in years. Judge Chen asked intelligent questions about strategic defense initiatives, about the challenges of commanding such a complex organization, about the integration of space-based assets with traditional military operations. His interest was genuine, informed by the kind of broad knowledge that comes from a lifetime of public service. More importantly, he listened to my answers with the attention they deserved, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated both understanding and respect for the complexity of my responsibilities. For the first time in family social setting, I found myself discussing my work with someone who appreciated its significance, rather than tolerating it as an unfortunate eccentricity. Sarah appeared at her father's elbow midway through our conversation, her expression curious and slightly amused. Up close, she was even more striking than she'd appeared from across the room, with the kind of understated confidence that comes from proving yourself in situations where failure isn't an option. Dad, are you interrogating Danny's sister about military strategy? She asked with fond exasperation. I told you to behave yourself tonight. Actually, Judge Chen replied, his tone carrying a note of pride, I'm having a fascinating discussion with General Martinez about missile defense systems. Did you know she commands the entire Space and Missile Defense Command? Sarah's reaction was instantaneous and electric. Her casual smile disappeared, replaced by something much sharper and more focused. Her posture shifted subtly, and when she looked at me, it was with the kind of assessment that one soldier gives another when meeting for the first time. General Martinez, she said, and her voice carried a note of something that might have been awe. I had no idea. Danny mentioned he had a sister in the military, but he never mentioned your rank. I glanced at Danny, who had the grace to look embarrassed. His failure to mention my actual position wasn't malicious, but it was revealing. In his mind, the details of my career weren't worth sharing, weren't significant enough to merit accurate representation, even to the woman he was planning to marry. Danny tends to downplay my work, I said diplomatically. He prefers to think of me as his big sister, rather than his commanding officer. The joke fell flat because it wasn't really a joke, and everyone present was intelligent enough to recognize the underlying tension. Sarah's eyes moved between Danny and me, clearly recalibrating her understanding of family dynamics based on this new information. Space and missile defense, she said thoughtfully. That's Huntsville and Colorado Springs, primary locations. You must work closely with the intelligence community on threat assessment. The observation demonstrated not just knowledge of military structure, but understanding of the interconnected nature of modern defense operations. Sarah wasn't just making polite conversation. She was showing that she understood the scope and significance of my responsibilities. Among other things, I agreed. Intelligence analysis is crucial to everything we do. Without accurate threat assessment, defensive systems are just expensive decorations. Sarah's smile was genuine now, the kind of expression that passes between professionals who recognize competence in each other. I'd love to hear more about your assessment protocols sometime. I spent 2 years in Afghanistan working threat analysis for forward operating bases. Very different scale, obviously, but similar principles. The conversation that followed was technical, detailed, and completely absorbing. Sarah had real experience with the kind of intelligence work that informed my strategic decisions, and her questions demonstrated both professional curiosity and genuine understanding. For the first time in months, I found myself discussing my work with someone who could appreciate its nuances without needing everything explained in civilian terms. Danny stood beside us, increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. His expression grew more strained with each exchange, and I could see him calculating how to redirect the discussion towards safer territory. When Sarah began describing a particular threat assessment she'd conducted in Kandahar province, he finally intervened. "This is all really interesting," he said with forced brightness, "but maybe we should talk about something everyone can follow. Sarah, didn't you want to tell Becca about the honeymoon plans?" The interruption was clumsy and obvious, but effective. Sarah's attention shifted immediately to her fiancé, and I could see her registering his discomfort with the turn our conversation had taken. Her expression softened as she recognized his need to redirect, and she gracefully allowed herself to be steered towards safer topics. But something had shifted in the room, some fundamental assumption had been challenged and found wanting. Judge Chen continued to treat me with obvious respect, asking about my experiences at various assignments and listening to my responses with the attention of someone who understood that he was speaking with a person of significant accomplishment. Other guests began to take notice of the deference being shown by one of the most respected figures in the room. Conversations that had excluded me before began to include me. Questions were asked with genuine interest rather than polite obligation, and I found myself being treated like someone whose opinions might actually matter. The change was subtle but unmistakable, and it clearly made my family uncomfortable. My mother's expression grew increasingly strained as the evening progressed, her smiles becoming more forced with each display of respect I received from Sarah's family and friends. Danny's attempts to redirect conversations away from my career became more frequent and more obvious, his discomfort palpable whenever someone expressed genuine interest in my work. But it was my father's reaction that surprised me most. Bob Martinez had always been proud of his children in his own way, but his pride had been reserved for achievements he could understand and relate to. Danny's success in insurance was something he could grasp, something that fit his understanding of how the world worked. My military career had always been foreign territory, something he supported in principle but couldn't quite connect to his definition of success. Tonight, though, watching respected members of the community treat his daughter with obvious deference, he seemed to be seeing me differently. When Judge Chen made a point of introducing me to other guests as General Martinez, who commands our missile defense systems, my father's chest swelled with something that looked remarkably like pride. "That's my daughter," he said to anyone who would listen, his voice carrying a note of wonder that suggested he was discovering this fact for the first time. "Rebecca, she's a 4-star general. Can you believe that, my little girl?" The transformation was both gratifying and painful. For 42 years, I'd been seeking exactly this kind of recognition from him, this acknowledgement that my achievements were worthy of his pride. Now that it was finally happening, it came tainted with the knowledge that it had taken other people's respect to make him see what had been there all along. The dinner wound down with toasts and well wishes, the kind of warm ritual that marks the transition from one phase of life to another. Danny spoke briefly about his gratitude for family and friends, his voice thick with emotion as he looked around the room at the people who had gathered to celebrate his happiness. When his eyes found mine, there was something in his expression that I couldn't quite read. Gratitude, perhaps, for my presence despite everything. Or maybe confusion about how the evening had unfolded so differently from what he'd expected. The sister he'd introduced as a government employee had somehow become the center of respectful attention, and I could see him struggling to reconcile this version of me with the one that existed in his mind. Sarah's toast was more composed but no less heartfelt. She thanked everyone for their support and friendship, her voice steady as she spoke about building a life with Danny based on mutual respect and shared values. But when she looked at me during her remarks, there was something speculative in her gaze, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. As the evening ended and people began to disperse, Judge Chen approached me one final time. His manner was formal but warm, the bearing of someone who had made a decision about how to treat a person of significance. "General Martinez," he said, extending his hand for what felt like an official farewell. "It's been an honor meeting you. I hope we'll have the opportunity to continue our conversation tomorrow." The phrase "continue our conversation" carried weight beyond its surface meaning. It suggested that he saw me as someone worth knowing better, someone whose perspectives and experiences added value to any gathering. After years of being treated as an embarrassing footnote to family events, the recognition felt almost overwhelming. "The honor has been mine, Judge Chen. Thank you for the warm welcome." As I drove back to my hotel through the quiet Phoenix streets, I found myself thinking about the evening's revelations. For the first time in years, I had been in a room where my achievements were recognized and valued, where my military service was seen as something worthy of respect rather than polite tolerance. But the recognition had come from strangers, people who owed me nothing and had no reason to inflate my importance. The people who shared my blood, who had known me longest, had been the ones most surprised by the respect I commanded from others. Tomorrow would bring the wedding itself, the formal ceremony where family dynamics would play out on an even larger stage. Tonight had shown me that not everyone saw my career as an embarrassing deviation from normal life. Tomorrow would test whether that recognition could survive the broader family narrative that had defined me for so long. The morning of Danny's wedding dawned clear and bright, the Arizona sun painting the desert in shades of gold and amber that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this landscape as a child. I stood on the small balcony of my hotel room, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up below me. Somewhere across town, my brother was probably getting ready for the most important day of his life, surrounded by groomsmen and family members who would help him transition from bachelor to husband. I wasn't part of that inner circle, hadn't been invited to participate in the morning preparations or the bonding rituals that would mark his final hours as a single man. The exclusion didn't surprise me anymore, but it still carried a dull ache, like an old injury that never quite healed properly. My phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Thompson, my deputy commander at Fort Carson. "Saw the news about the Senate confirmation hearings for the new SecDef. Thought you should know your name came up as a potential successor to General Harrison when he retires next year. Big things ahead, General." The message should have filled me with satisfaction, maybe even excitement. Being mentioned as a potential candidate for one of the highest positions in the military hierarchy was recognition of the highest order, validation that my career had reached the level where I was considered among the nation's most capable military leaders. Instead, I felt only a distant sense of irony. Here I was, being discussed in Washington corridors of power as a potential leader of hundreds of thousands of troops, while my own family couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge my current rank without discomfort. The contrast between my professional recognition and personal invisibility had never been starker. I set the phone aside and focused on getting ready for the ceremony. The navy dress I'd chosen looked appropriate in the mirror, elegant but not attention-grabbing, the kind of outfit that would photograph well without upstaging the bride. My hair was pulled back in a simple chignon, my makeup understated but polished. I looked like exactly what I was supposed to be, the respectable sister who would blend seamlessly into the background of family photos. The drive to Desert Ridge Country Club took me through neighborhoods I remembered from childhood, past schools and parks and shopping centers that held fragments of memory. This was the landscape that had shaped me, the place where I'd first learned to dream beyond the horizons that others had set for my life. Now it felt foreign, like visiting a museum dedicated to someone else's childhood. The country club was bustling with activity when I arrived, vendors making final preparations and staff arranging flowers and adjusting table settings. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock, with cocktails to follow immediately and dinner at 6. I was early, hoping to find a quiet place to sit and observe, without getting drawn into the pre-wedding chaos. The gardens where the ceremony would take place were stunning, a carefully curated blend of native desert plants and cultivated flowers that created an oasis of beauty against the stark mountain backdrop. Rows of white chairs faced an altar decorated with saguaro blossoms and palo verde branches, the whole scene designed to capture the essence of Arizona's austere magnificence. I found a bench near the back of the garden, partially shaded by a mesquite tree, and settled in to watch the final preparations. Staff members moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting sound equipment and positioning photographers, their movements choreographed by years of experience with high-end weddings. That's when I noticed her, a woman in army dress blues standing near the entrance to the garden, her posture unmistakably military despite the civilian setting. She was tall and athletic, with short auburn hair and the kind of bearing that suggested command experience. When she turned slightly, I caught sight of the eagles on her collar that marked her as a colonel. Curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself walking toward her, drawn by the rare sight of another military officer at what I'd assumed would be an entirely civilian affair. As I approached, she turned to face me, and I saw recognition flicker in her eyes. "General Martinez?" she said, her voice carrying the crisp cadence of someone accustomed to military precision. "I'm Colonel Rebecca Torres, 3rd Armored Brigade. I served under your command when you were at Fort Hood." The name clicked immediately. Colonel Torres had been one of my most capable brigade commanders during my time as division commander in Texas, a rising star who'd consistently impressed me with her tactical acumen and leadership style. Seeing her here was unexpected, but it explained why Sarah might have military colleagues at her wedding. "Colonel Torres, good to see you again. I take it you know Captain Chen?" "Yes, ma'am. Sarah and I went through the intelligence officers course together at Fort Huachuca. We've stayed in touch over the years." She mentioned that her fiancé had a sister in the military, but she didn't mention your rank or position. The familiar pattern again. Sarah knew I was military, but hadn't been given the details that would have made my true position clear. I wondered if this was Danny's doing, his way of managing information to avoid uncomfortable questions, or if my family's tendency to minimize my career had simply been absorbed and repeated by osmosis. "Sarah seems like an exceptional officer," I said, genuinely meaning it. "Danny's lucky to have found someone with her qualifications and character." Colonel Torres smiled, the expression warming her features in a way that suggested genuine fondness for the bride. "She is exceptional, one of the smartest analysts I've ever worked with, and completely fearless when it comes to speaking truth to power. Your brother is getting a hell of a partner." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other guests, families and friends who began filling the garden chairs in preparation for the ceremony. Colonel Torres excused herself to find her seat, but not before expressing hope that we'd have the chance to talk more during the reception. I returned to my assigned seat in the back row, watching as the garden filled with people I mostly didn't recognize. Sarah's side of the aisle was populated with what appeared to be a mix of military colleagues, legal professionals from her father's circle, and extended family members who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of successful people. Danny's side was more familiar, filled with relatives and family friends I remembered from childhood gatherings. My parents sat in the front row, my mother resplendent in a pale blue dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, my father handsome in his dark suit but somehow diminished by the formal setting. The processional began with a string quartet playing something classical and romantic. Sarah's bridesmaids walked down the aisle in elegant champagne-colored dresses, each carrying a small bouquet of desert wildflowers. They were followed by Danny's groomsmen, college friends, and work colleagues, who looked slightly uncomfortable in their formal wear but determined to fulfill their ceremonial obligations. Then came Sarah herself, escorted by her father, and even from my distant seat I could see why Danny had fallen so completely under her spell. She was radiant in a way that transcended mere physical beauty, carrying herself with the kind of composed grace that comes from absolute confidence in one's place in the world. Her dress was elegant but not ostentatious, her smile genuine and warm as she made eye contact with guests throughout her journey down the aisle. But it was her bearing that struck me most forcefully. Even in her wedding dress, even in this most civilian of ceremonies, Sarah Chen carried herself like a soldier. Her back was straight, her steps measured and deliberate, her head held high with the kind of dignity that can't be taught or faked. She was a woman who had commanded respect in some of the most dangerous places on earth, and that strength showed in every movement she made. Judge Chen walked with obvious pride, his love for his daughter evident in the way he held her arm and the careful attention he paid to her comfort as they navigated the garden path. When they reached the altar, he kissed her cheek and placed her hand in Danny's with a solemnity that spoke to the significance of the moment. The ceremony itself was beautiful, a blend of traditional elements and personal touches that reflected both families' values and the couple's shared commitment to building something lasting together. The officiant spoke about partnership and mutual respect, about the importance of supporting each other's dreams and ambitions, about the strength that comes from two people choosing to face life's challenges together. When Danny and Sarah exchanged vows, their words were personal and heartfelt, filled with references to the journey that had brought them together and the future they planned to build. Danny spoke about finding someone who challenged him to be better, who brought out qualities in him that he didn't know he possessed. Sarah talked about partnership in its truest sense, about finding someone who saw her strength as an asset rather than a threat, who supported her ambitions rather than asking her to diminish herself for his comfort. Listening to their words, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Joy for my brother, who had clearly found someone extraordinary to share his life with. Admiration for Sarah, who had articulated something I'd never been able to express about the kind of partnership I'd always wanted but never found. And a deep, familiar sadness about the gap between the kind of support they were promising each other and the kind of acceptance I'd never received from my own family. The ceremony concluded with the traditional kiss and recessional, the newly married couple walking back down the aisle together while guests applauded and photographers captured every moment. As they passed my row, Sarah's eyes found mine for just a moment, and she offered a small smile that seemed to acknowledge our brief conversation from the night before. The cocktail hour that followed was held on the club's terrace, overlooking the golf course and the distant mountains that ringed the Phoenix Valley. I found myself gravitating toward the edges of the crowd, nursing a glass of wine and observing the social dynamics that swirled around the bride and groom. Danny was in his element, moving effortlessly between groups of guests, telling stories and accepting congratulations with the easy charm that had always been his greatest asset. He looked genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen since we were children, his face animated by joy and excitement about the future he and Sarah would build together. Sarah was equally gracious, but in a different way, her interactions marked by the kind of focused attention that suggested she was genuinely interested in each person she spoke with. I watched her talk with elderly relatives and young colleagues with equal engagement, asking thoughtful questions and listening to the answers with apparent fascination. But it was her interactions with the military guests that caught my attention most. When she spoke with Colonel Torres and the other officers who had come to celebrate her marriage, her entire demeanor shifted subtly. Her posture became more formal, her language more precise, her expressions more guarded. It was as if she were code-switching between her roles as bride and officer, adapting her behavior to match the expectations of each audience. The phenomenon was familiar to me, the constant adjustment required when moving between military and civilian contexts, the exhausting work of translation that most people never noticed, but that became second nature to anyone who lived with a foot in both worlds. Watching Sarah navigate these transitions with such apparent ease, I felt a recognition that went beyond professional admiration. About an hour into the cocktail hour, My mother approached me with the determined expression that usually preceded an uncomfortable conversation. She was holding a glass of champagne and wearing the kind of bright smile that suggested she was working hard to maintain her composure. "Rebecca, dear, you look lovely. That dress is perfect for the occasion." The compliment was delivered with the slightly surprised tone that suggested she hadn't expected me to choose appropriately without guidance. "Thank you, Mom. It's a beautiful wedding. Sarah seems wonderful." "Oh, she is, she really is. So accomplished, so poised. Danny is very lucky." She paused, glancing around to make sure we wouldn't be overheard. "I wanted to thank you for last night, for being so gracious with Judge Chen and his questions. I know it can be uncomfortable when people make such a big deal about your work." The phrasing was carefully neutral, but the underlying message was clear. My mother saw the respect I'd received from Sarah's family as an inconvenience rather than a source of pride, something to be managed rather than celebrated. In her mind, the attention my military rank commanded was a complication that threatened to disrupt the careful social equilibrium she worked so hard to maintain. "It wasn't uncomfortable at all," I replied evenly. "Judge Chen is very knowledgeable about defense issues. It was refreshing to have an informed conversation about my work for once." She blinked at the mild rebuke, her smile faltering slightly before she forced it back into place. "Of course, dear, I just want everyone to feel comfortable, to focus on the important things. This is Danny and Sarah's day, after all. The important things." Once again, my career was relegated to the category of distractions, things that drew attention away from what really mattered. I wondered if she would feel the same way if I were a successful doctor or lawyer, if any professional achievement would be seen as an inappropriate focus for attention at a family gathering. Before I could respond, we were interrupted by the arrival of Sarah herself, who approached with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had something specific she wanted to discuss. She looked radiant in her wedding dress, but there was something in her expression that reminded me of the officer I'd glimpsed in our brief conversations. "Mrs. Martinez, I hope you don't mind if I steal Rebecca for a few minutes. There's someone I'd like her to meet." My mother's smile became even brighter and more brittle. "Of course, dear. You look absolutely stunning." "Just stunning." Sarah thanked her graciously and then turned to me with an expression that was harder to read. "Would you mind taking a walk with me? There's something I'd like to discuss." We moved away from the main crowd, walking toward a quieter section of the terrace that offered a view of the desert landscape beyond the golf course. For a few moments we walked in comfortable silence, both of us seeming to appreciate the brief respite from the social demands of the reception. "I owe you an apology," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying the kind of directness that I associated with military communication. "I had no idea about your rank or position when we met last night. Danny mentioned he had a sister in the military, but he described you as working in administration somewhere in Colorado." The revelation wasn't surprising, but it still stung. Administration. As if commanding one of the most technologically advanced military installations in the world was equivalent to filing paperwork in some anonymous government office. The diminishment was so complete, so thorough, that it bordered on erasure. "Danny means well," I said diplomatically, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. "He's never been entirely comfortable with what I do for a living." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face me directly, her expression serious in a way that suggested we were about to have a conversation that went beyond polite social pleasantries. "General Martinez, with all due respect, there's a difference between being uncomfortable and actively misrepresenting someone's achievements. You're a 4-star general. You command critical defense infrastructure. You're one of the most senior military leaders in the country." The words carried a weight that went beyond simple acknowledgement. Sarah wasn't just stating facts. She was expressing something that sounded like indignation on my behalf, as if my family's treatment of my career was a personal affront to her sense of justice. "Not everyone sees military service the same way we do," I replied carefully. "My family has different values, different priorities. They're not anti-military, they just don't understand why someone would choose this life." "This isn't about different values," Sarah said firmly. "This is about respect. About recognizing excellence when it's sitting right in front of you. Do you know what I told Colonel Torres when she mentioned seeing you here? I told her there was no way Danny's sister could be General Rebecca Martinez, because surely someone in his family would have mentioned that their daughter was one of the most respected leaders in the entire United States military. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a microphone being tested, the feedback echoing across the terrace as the wedding coordinator prepared to transition guests from cocktails to dinner. Sarah glanced toward the sound, clearly aware that her duties as bride would soon require her return to the celebration. "I need to get back," she said, but her expression suggested there was more she wanted to say. "But I want you to know that what happened last night, the way your family acted like your career was some kind of embarrassing secret, that's not acceptable. Not to me, and not to anyone who understands what you've accomplished." Before I could respond, she was moving back toward the crowd, her dress flowing behind her as she returned to her role as the gracious bride, accepting congratulations and posing for photographs. But something in her expression had changed, a hardness around the edges that suggested our conversation had affected her more than she'd initially let on. The dinner that followed was held in the club's main ballroom, an elegant space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the desert landscape. The tables were arranged in careful configurations that reflected both families' social hierarchies and the complex web of relationships that connected the various guests. I found myself seated at a table near the back of the room, far from the head table where the wedding party held court. My table mates were a mix of distant relatives and family friends, people who knew me peripherally but had no particular investment in engaging with me beyond basic politeness. The meal was excellent, multiple courses of expertly prepared food accompanied by carefully selected wines. The conversation at my table was pleasant but superficial, the kind of polite exchange that fills time without creating genuine connection. I found myself thinking about Sarah's words, about the gap between the recognition I received in professional settings and the invisibility I experienced within my own family. After the main course was cleared, the traditional toasts began. The best man spoke first, sharing carefully sanitized stories about Danny's bachelor years and expressing confidence in his choice of bride. The maid of honor followed with similar remarks about Sarah, touching on her accomplishments in general terms, while focusing primarily on her personal qualities as a friend and partner. Then Judge Chen rose to speak, his bearing formal and dignified as he approached the microphone. His remarks were thoughtful and substantive, touching on the qualities he saw in both bride and groom, and expressing his confidence in their future together. When he spoke about Sarah's military service, he did so with obvious pride and detailed knowledge of her achievements. "My daughter has served her country with distinction," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "She has demonstrated courage under fire, intelligence in analysis, and leadership in some of the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The qualities that made her an exceptional officer are the same qualities that will make her an exceptional wife and partner." The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, and I could see Sarah's colleagues at various tables responding with the kind of recognition that one professional gives another. For a moment I allowed myself to imagine what it would feel like to hear similar words from my own father, to have my military service acknowledged with pride rather than tolerant embarrassment. But when my father rose to speak on behalf of the groom's family, his remarks took a different direction entirely. He spoke about Danny with genuine warmth and affection, sharing stories about his childhood and expressing pride in the man he had become. When he mentioned family, his eyes swept the room, landing briefly on me before moving on without acknowledgement. "Danny has always been blessed with a loving family," he said. "People who have supported his dreams and celebrated his successes. Today, that family grows to include Sarah and her wonderful parents, and we couldn't be happier to welcome them into our circle." The irony was perfect and devastating. Here was my father, speaking about the importance of family support while systematically excluding me from both his remarks and his recognition. The message was clear. I might be present at the celebration, but I wasn't truly part of the family story he was telling. The formal program continued with more toasts and ceremonial moments, but I found myself increasingly detached from the proceedings. The combination of wine and emotional exhaustion was making it difficult to maintain the pleasant expression I'd worn throughout the day, and I was beginning to consider making an early exit when everything changed. Sarah rose from her seat at the head table, moving with the kind of deliberate purpose that suggested she had made a decision about something important. Instead of returning to her chair after the previous speaker finished, she approached the microphone with an expression that seemed both determined and slightly dangerous. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this wonderful day with Danny and me," she began, her voice clear and strong. "Your presence means more to us than we can adequately express." The standard opening suggested another gracious thank you speech, the kind of remarks that brides typically offered to close out the formal portion of the evening. But something in Sarah's posture suggested that standard wasn't what we were about to get. "Before we move on to dancing and celebration, there's something I need to address. Something that's been weighing on my mind since last night." She paused, her eyes scanning the room before settling on our table. "It has to do with recognition, with giving credit where credit is due, and with honoring the people who deserve our respect and gratitude." The room grew quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over an audience when they sense that something significant is about to happen. I felt my heart rate increase, though I couldn't yet articulate why Sarah's words were triggering such a strong physical response. Yesterday evening, I had the privilege of meeting someone who has dedicated her life to protecting our freedom and security. Someone who has achieved the highest levels of military leadership through decades of distinguished service. Someone who has literally put her life on the line for all of us. My throat went dry. Around me, I could sense people shifting in their seats, trying to follow Sarah's words to their logical conclusion. At the head table, Danny's expression had shifted from pleasant attention to something approaching alarm. I'm talking about General Rebecca Martinez, Danny's sister, who commands the Space and Missile Defense Command and holds the rank of 4-star general in the United States Army. The silence that followed was profound and electric. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, felt the weight of recognition settling over the ballroom like a physical presence. My heart was hammering so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. Sarah wasn't finished. In a room full of accomplished people, General Martinez represents the very highest levels of achievement and service. She has dedicated her life to protecting all of us, and she deserves our recognition and gratitude. Then, in a moment that seemed to unfold in slow motion, Captain Sarah Chen came to attention in her wedding dress and rendered a perfect military salute in my direction. "4-star general, ma'am," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Colonel Torres stood instantly, snapping to attention and rendering her own salute. Other military guests followed, and then, remarkably, civilians began to rise as well, some applauding, some simply standing in recognition of what had just occurred. I sat frozen, unable to move or speak, as the applause built around me. This was beyond my wildest imagination, beyond anything I had dared to hope for. In front of my entire family, in front of everyone who had spent years minimizing my achievements, I was being recognized for exactly what I was and what I had accomplished. The applause continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When it finally died down, Sarah was still standing at the microphone, still looking directly at me with an expression of profound respect. "Thank you, General Martinez, for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. And thank you for being here to celebrate this special day with us." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and congratulations. People who had barely acknowledged my presence earlier in the day approached with genuine interest and respect. My parents looked stunned, clearly struggling to process what had just happened and what it meant for their carefully constructed family narrative. But it was Danny's reaction that affected me most deeply. He found me near the end of the evening, as guests were beginning to depart, his expression a complex mix of emotions I couldn't entirely read. "Becca," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. A big one. I had no idea that Sarah was going to do that, but I'm glad she did. You deserved that recognition. Deserved it years ago." "Danny, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. I've been a terrible brother, a terrible family member. I let Mom and Dad set the tone about your career, let them make it seem like something to be ashamed of, instead of something to be proud of. That ends now." The conversation that followed was more honest than any we'd had in years. Danny acknowledged the ways he had failed to support me, the ways the family had systematically diminished my achievements, the damage that had been done by years of treating my military service as an embarrassing eccentricity rather than a source of pride. It wasn't a complete healing, wasn't enough to repair decades of accumulated hurt, but it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that things had been wrong and needed to change. As I drove back to my hotel that night, I thought about Sarah's courage in making such a public statement, about the risk she had taken in challenging my family's narrative on what should have been her day. She had used her position as bride, her moment in the spotlight, to correct an injustice that had nothing directly to do with her. The gesture was more than recognition, it was advocacy, an act of solidarity between one military officer and another. Sarah had seen something that was wrong, and had used her power to make it right, regardless of the potential consequences or awkwardness it might create. 3 months later, I received a handwritten note from Sarah, sent to my office at Fort Carson. She and Danny were settled into married life, she wrote, and she wanted me to know that her recognition of me at the wedding had been one of the moments she was most proud of from that entire day. Some things are more important than social comfort, she wrote. Recognition of excellence is one of them. I'm proud to call you family, and I'm proud that my husband's sister is someone who has achieved so much in service to our country. The letter sat on my desk for weeks, a tangible reminder that sometimes recognition comes from unexpected sources, that allies can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. Sarah Chen had given me something I'd been seeking my entire adult life: acknowledgement from someone who mattered, respect from someone whose opinion carried weight. But more than that, she had shown me that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes family is about the people who see you clearly, who recognize your worth without qualification or condition, who are willing to use their own standing to elevate yours when the moment requires it. The little girl who had once made her bed with military precision, who had sought perfection as a path to acceptance, finally understood that the acceptance she'd been seeking had been available all along. It just hadn't come from the people she'd expected to provide it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.